Hello and welcome. This is a new series where I argue with Fukuyama. So I just take snippets of Fukuyama's lectures and debates, and just get particular arguments that he makes and argue with it. As many of you who follow this channel will know, Fukuyama isn't some complete idiot. He does present some decent arguments, and he does have an awareness of some of the issues and limitations of liberalism. Which some will be surprised to hear from him, but he does ultimately think that liberalism can overcome these limitations. So I'm going to be generally arguing that maybe it can't. So I'm going to pick on particular issues that he talks about, get snippets from his debates and lectures where we can kind of concretely see what he has to say, and then just discuss it. So the first one I'm going to do is the problem of martial virtue, or can liberal societies defend themselves, defend their own ways of life, defend their own values? Does liberalism have this sort of pacifying and kind of effeminizing and kind of not force people, but does it lead to people simply being concerned with material things and kind of losing their ability to really act in a way which we could say is conducive to some sort of martial virtue? And so here's a clip from
creativity. Finally, let's get to simply martial virtue, because there is this charge that that liberal societies produce soft people that are too materially preoccupied and self-centered to actually even defend themselves in their own liberal way of life. And I do think that there is something to that charge, because because liberalism is basically a lowering of the sights of politics, it tends to be the most appreciated when you see the opposite of it. Right? So when you live in a world that is racked by war, like Europe was at the end of the 150 years of religious wars following the Protestant Revolution, or as Europe was again in 1945 following on two horrendous world wars, you like liberal institutions because you just want to survive. You realize that aspiring to have your ethnic group dominate other ethnic groups is really not a safe way to live, so you accept liberalism. Or if you live in a dictatorship, if you lived in the communist world in the days when there was a Soviet Union, you really wanted to live in a liberal society where you could be free to travel, to think, to criticize, to do all the sorts of things we do in liberal societies. And for that reason, the first generation, and after the fall of communism, were dedicated liberals. But I think the problem is that it's easy to take liberalism for granted, right? It's easy to just assume that our peace and prosperity are going to be there forever, because if you've grown up, after 1945, or after, especially in Eastern Europe, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, you say, well, the world's been pretty good, and I actually think the big problem is now the European Union. That's the really evil source of dictatorship in my life. And it's sometimes helpful to be reminded that the real alternative to liberalism is something pretty terrible. And in that respect, I actually think that Mr. Putin has done us a big favor, because he's kind of reminded us that, he's the one that said that liberalism is an obsolete doctrine back in 2019. But in terms of just martial virtues, it's very interesting what's going on in the Ukraine war right now. 250,000 Ukrainians came back to Ukraine in order to fight the Russians. So right now, all work on the metro in Warsaw has stopped. These were all emigre Ukrainians that were building the metro. They've all gone back to fight for their country. In the meantime, thousands of Russians are leaving Russia because they don't want to fight in Putin's war. And it's actually the fact that Ukraine has evolved as a liberal society that they're doing this. That they're not centralized. They've got a very decentralized command structure. that allows lower-level commanders to take initiative. The Russians have a single guy at the top that is giving the orders. He seems to be pretty isolated and out of touch with reality, which is why they've ended up in such a disastrous strategic situation. But the tactical situation is also not good because nobody's allowed to think for themselves, and they can't take advantage of local knowledge and initiative and the like. And I think that just indicates that liberal societies are perfectly capable of being martial if they are correctly unified with a national idea. So this is an issue that I've written about in my forthcoming book that has the same title as this conference. But liberalism actually does need a nation in order to function. Liberalism as an abstract concept is not something that people fight for. They only fight for it when it's actually embodied in an actual nation. There are a number of reasons why this is true, having to do with, I think, just with the the social nature of human consciousness. So if you think about Ukraine right now, there's this argument going on, are they actually fighting for democracy or are they fighting just for sovereignty? And they don't actually care what kind of regime they have. And I think it's sort of a meaningless question. I've been to Ukraine a lot in the last 8 years, and I know a lot of Ukrainians, and I know there's a lot of them that actually really do believe in some version of liberalism and some version, they want to be Europeans, but they're also patriotic Ukrainians that wouldn't sacrifice themselves for liberalism in another country. And so the two are very closely intertwined. And that's another example of the way I think that classical liberalism works. It's not a break from every previous cultural tradition. It actually needs those cultural traditions in order to survive. And some of the best real existing, as the Marxists used to say, some of the best real existing liberal societies are ones that do have a strong sense of national identity. But that national identity has to be a liberal one. And if it degenerates into something in which there's an assumption that everybody's going to agree on a single final end defined by religion or by a particular kind of non-inclusive version of national culture, then it's really not going to work as the basis of a truly liberal society. So with that.
So as you see, Fukuyama, he's not totally unaware of this issue. He admits that it is an issue, but he thinks it's something that we can overcome. And he thinks it's something we can overcome on account of specifically one thing, and it's that we can sort of unify ourselves under a national identity. So he thinks that if we can properly infuse nationalism, but like a liberal version of nationalism, with liberal values, that this problem will not be something which could destroy a liberal society. So nationalism, although it's specifically liberal nationalism, is the answer to this question. It is the route through which this problem can be overcome. So his claims about the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which he's using as an example to sort of show that it is possible. I'm going to use this as a specific example, and I actually think it's an example of perhaps something which undermines what he's saying. So I'm going to just outright dismiss the claims about Russia, people fleeing Russia to avoid being conscripted. I mean, come on. I mean, that's going to happen to some extent in every single society. It's certainly not excessive within Russia. Polls and statistics, when you were asked, would you die for your country if you risk your life, at least for your country, if the situation emerged, most of these polls show that it's actually the US and Western Europe where the answer is rather unfavorable to martial virtue, as in no, they wouldn't. It's and that's a complicated phenomena. It's not reducible to to just saying, oh, they're all just decadent cowards or something. Not really. I mean, like, the West also has a history of being aware of things like the military-industrial complex, global capitalism, things which could push us into conflict and war for arbitrary or unjustifiable reasons. Western societies have developed an awareness of the misuse of military force to a much more sophisticated degree than other countries have, other civilizations have. So those statistics aren't necessarily all bad, but it's probably a bit of both. It probably is legitimately like 50%. Because of the kind of negative influence of liberalism on martial virtue, and it's probably 50% because of the sort of standards around martial virtue as well, which have been developed in the West. Because you have to remember, the West has a very high standard of martial virtue in its traditional form, right? Think of the Greeks, think of the Romans, think of the Crusaders, and so on and so forth. So it's a complicated. It's a complicated ground, but nonetheless, I don't think we can accuse, Russia of having people fleeing. So anyway, I think we can dismiss that outright. Fukuyama claims 250,000 people have returned back to Ukraine to help fight against the Russian invasion. I don't doubt that that's true. Although I will say that I do see a lot of them. Living in a Western European country, I do see a lot of them. Here walking around. I don't just see women and children and old people. I'm not judging anybody. If I personally didn't think a war was justifiable to fight, I'd probably consider getting out there too. I'm not morally judging anybody. I'm just saying, let's not kind of fetishize and romanticize, Ukrainian people here, because the rest of us Westerners are kind of caught in it. Like, we're not in a dangerous position, at least now. We're sort of safer and more secure, and we don't have to worry about being invaded and so forth. It's like, let's avoid like fetishizing and romanticizing these people and saying, oh, look, but they're liberals and too, and there's something a bit insidious about that, actually. But let's take a look at the actual situation in Ukraine, because this debate was conducted a year ago, so we have a year hindsight to look at the situation. It's looking at the moment like there probably will be negotiations conducted soon enough, probably within the next few months. Who knows? But certainly the Ukrainians have fought bravely. They've certainly put up a better resistance than anyone thought they would have been able to. But then you have to ask yourself, did Putin want to take Kiev? Was that really his goal, or did he just kind of want to control certain parts of the country in a way in which you didn't really know what he was going to do, to kind of force an agreement with the Ukrainians, so that the Ukrainians had to negotiate around buffering distances, not being a part of NATO, and so on and so on. I think that's more likely. But anyway, look, nonetheless, no one can take away the fact that a lot of Ukrainians have fought very bravely and so forth. But the question of whether or not this capacity to do what they have done is identifiable as a liberal form of nationalism, I'm not sure, because going back to the 2014 coup, which led to the whole kind of civil war situation between the East and the West within Ukraine to begin with, this it wasn't exclusive to, but you did have a significant and loud segment of much more hardline nationalists, much more kind of ethno-nationalists, kind of neo-Nazi elements in the Ukraine, which certainly are not reducible to this sort of liberal nationalism which Fukuyama is discussing. So if you were to remove those hardline nationalist elements in the Ukraine, what would the situation have looked like? Well, paradoxically, it may not have led to a coup to begin with, so you may not have had the civil war to begin with, so you may not have had the invasion to begin with. But let's just say you did have the invasion nonetheless. Would a significant resistance be put up without those hardline nationalist components? I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. This is really the problem with Fukuyama's argument, is that it always ignores these more immoderate, extreme, and illiberal elements who do, who kind of do the heavy lifting in a movement, and that could be, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East. It could be within the French Revolution. It can be certain, more extreme elements of the Jacobins. Within the Irish War of Independence, it wasn't all like just let's be liberal Republicans or something. You had brown shirts as well. You had much more hardline kind of nationalist components. It seems that wherever you look, actually, where you do see kind of heroic, you do see liberal democratic societies being able to pull off, a military victory over an imperial force or an aggressive neighbor or a tyrant. That you actually see the presence of what cannot be reduced to this kind of liberal nationalism. It's something which is excessive to that. And now you have to ask yourself then, well, if that's the case, then why in these sorts of situations do liberal societies or democratic societies rely on these, excessive elements? To quote Bane from Batman, victory has defeated you. You have this problem with liberal societies in that they're so sort of innovative and good at creating wealth and so on, that they end up sort of neglecting that element to their character. They end up neglecting those practices and virtues which are conducive to military virtue. So Fukuyama, like me, thinks that you should have national service, right? That you should have some sort of minimal period where you have to do, I don't know, I'm not saying you have to do anything like extreme, but you have to be at least trained in a way in which, should a certain situations come about, that you're at least minimally prepared. That could be a kind of duty of the status of citizen. Although I would only have that for young men. I wouldn't have it for women as well, and I obviously wouldn't have it for old people. And then that brings up all of these problems, because if we're going to introduce higher expectations on fighting age young men, but we're also going to let everyone else vote, or everyone else have the same rights as them, and they're literally kind of in this position of, well, if my nation calls it upon me, I have to die for them. It's a bit unfair, right? Because, for example, you have this contradiction in modern societies, in democratic societies, where old people and women can vote, but they're exempt from military service. They're exempt from conscription. If we were to have conscription, or if we were to have military service and so on, they're exempt from it. So it's a bit unfair, because it's like, well, if a society builds up high living standards for itself and expectations for itself, but those living standards and expectations rely on a military to enforce the safety of certain trade routes, or the flow of certain oil supplies in certain directions, and we're going to be conscripted off to go and defend these things. And are we risking our lives then, not for the good of our nation, but just for the good of material comforts of what are a politically powerful class of exempt people, right? This kind of exempt class of of women and old people who can vote and send us off to die, but don't have to risk their own lives. This is a real problem, and this is not a problem which modern societies have ever kind of had to deal with. And this is why the Ukraine conflict is so interesting, is because suddenly we do have to think about this. And it's not just me thinking about it; this is also Fukuyama thinking about this, although in a different way. I mean, perhaps his own way, but he is bringing up this issue of martial virtue. Because what happened in traditional societies that were more militaristic and did have a kind of higher sense of military virtue, they were normally run by men. And so, sometimes you could get old people who had a lot of power, who were exempt from military service, kind of old men who were exempt from military service, who could send young men off to die. Sure, you've always had that problem to a certain extent, but this was a very small, elite ruling class. Now you have, for example, like the boomers, this like massive, middle and upper middle class segment of the population that has extremely high living standards, expectations, and votes, and makes up a massive voting demographic. So the government's then in this position of like, well, we got to please them, and but they're exempt, so like it's tricky. It's tricky because historically, we've told ourselves that we can move into a post-war era, that we don't have to have military service, we don't have to have martial virtue. And then suddenly the Ukraine conflict is reminding us that that's not necessarily true. But then we're thinking, but how can we have martial virtue? Because how can we expect, because we've built our society around the idea that we're not going to have war anymore, that we're not going to have military service, and we're not going to have these conflicts. So it didn't matter if old people it didn't matter if these militarily exempt classes had the right to vote and had high living standards, and those living standards were connected to trade routes which had to be sometimes enforced through military. It didn't really matter because we told ourselves, well, the world's going to be all peaceful, unified, and everything's just going to be about trade, and we're all going to be so rational and blah 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 blah. And suddenly that's not true, and now we're like, well, okay, now we have to reinstall military virtue back into that society. Well, how do we do that? Because the conditions which are actually more conducive to military virtue have been deconstructed and destroyed, deconstructed and destroyed. So now we're in a really shitty situation. So that's certainly something that Fukuyama hasn't really grappled with. And it's hard to grapple with these questions also within a liberal framework. Right, so it's kind of twofold, we could say. On one hand, liberal societies, when they're in a position of needing military virtue, tend to rely on excessive illiberal elements, which they don't want to talk about, and they don't want to acknowledge the presence of, and they also believe that these elements can simply be done away with once the goals, the military goals have been reached, that these elements can simply be done away with. And I think, if anything, the 20th century shows completely otherwise, right? Because you had World War One, and World War One completely radicalized a whole generation of men, and then after World War One, you had Bolshevism, and then later on, you had fascism. So it's like, you can't put young men into these situations where it sort of puts them on the extremes of life. War being probably the most extreme form of human life, and then go, oh, we're going to reintegrate you back into good old bourgeois domesticated liberal society, and well, that's just the way it's going to be. Not really. It doesn't really work that way. So what do you do with these excessive elements? I think a lot of our politics actually surrounds this question of what do we do with these excessive elements and so on. And the question is whether a liberal society can integrate these elements into it in a way which is adequate, we could say. Often, I think liberal societies can be so destabilized by times of conflict and war, because they tend to put themselves into this position of neglecting martial virtue, and then suddenly the reality of the need for it violently forces itself upon us, and then we don't know what to do. We're like unprepared. So there's this little tiny passage from Plato, the book The Statesman, in which he discusses this. And now obviously Plato couldn't be, he wasn't talking from from the perspective of a modern liberal society, but he was part of Athens, and Athens had some sort of quasi-liberal character to it, we could say, that is perhaps relatable to the West today, insofar as that Athens was a society which was extremely prosperous. It had a lot of intellectual and cultural achievements, and suddenly it was involved in the Peloponnesian War against the very militaristic Spartans, and it lost that war. And that was that, and that whole period was when Plato was alive during most of his the first, I don't know, whatever, how long the war went on for, like 30 years or whatever. The first 30 years around of his life was basically informed by that war. So in The Statesman, they bring up this question, right, and of peace and war, and they say, the stranger, who's this character who comes into Athens and to perhaps warn them of something, says, for the orderly class are always ready to lead a peaceful life, quietly doing their own business. This is their manner of behaving with all men at home, and they are equally ready to find some way of keeping the peace with foreign states. And on account of this fondness of theirs for peace, which is often out of season where their influence prevails, they become by degrees unwarlike and bring up their young men to be like themselves. They are at the mercy of their enemies, whence in a few years they and their children and the whole city often pass imperceptibly from the condition of free men into that of slaves. So you have this warning being given to the Athenians, well, basically by Plato, but so in a sense they're warning themselves, but of what happens when you have a society which is ruled particularly by people who are excessively, let's say, peace-like, excessively cooperative and diplomatic and prosperous, and so on and so forth. A society which is geared towards the opposite to the opposite set of characteristics and traits to military virtue. That you have what he calls an imperceptible slide into a kind of form of slavery, and I like that because it's sort of imperceptible. You don't even realize it's happening until it's happened, and I think that's exactly where we're at in some ways with this conflict with the Ukraine, because we've told ourselves, post-war period, we don't have to worry about war anymore. We don't have to worry about martial virtue. We don't have to worry about preparing for these things. Blah, blah, blah. Also, because nuclear weapons can sort of handle that for us. We've sort of outsourced military virtue to technology as well. But when these things happen, suddenly it's like, oh shit. Are we really free men? Are we really capable of defending our sovereignty? Do we have what it takes? So the question remains: does a liberal national character have what it takes to be willing to defend itself? I would say also, does it have what it takes to conduct, martial virtues to be not exploited also by certain forces within a society. So this is why I'm slightly sympathetic of Lenin, because I think that this was part of his kind of overall project. You had so many people volunteer in World War I in Western societies. I think probably far more people in Western Europe were willing to volunteer to give their lives for their nations, probably than anywhere else in the world at the time. And the catastrophes of World War I. I mean, if you think about all these men who were sent off into these trenches to be just gunned down by machine guns with these terrible orders from these really incompetent and crappy generals, And then you have the realization of, like, what the wars are about, to do with, kind of wealth expansion, trade routes, the kind of class dimension to it, the economic dimension to it that I mentioned earlier. You're also going to have to conduct. So this is so there's kind of two goals there, basically, to try achieve. One is to retain a warlike character, for certain situations when it's necessary, and the other is to not let that warlike character be kind of degraded and exploited and manipulated by forces in a society which are sort of not legitimately geared towards the good and sovereignty of that society, but have other interests at heart. Can a liberal society achieve either of these things? Can a liberal nationalism achieve either of these things? I think maybe not. Like, I don't really see any good evidence for that. I can't think of really any good examples for that. When successes are there, it tends to be with relationships to things which are illiberal and extreme, whether those be the Muslim Brotherhood, whether those be the kind of ethno-nationalist elements in Ukraine, whether those be the kind of Jacobins and so forth, and so on, and has what elements of society have sort of developed a higher state of consciousness around the misuse of the military as an institution, and of the heroic character of the individuals involved. That's been kind of like things which are also illiberal in many ways, like Marxism, for example. So I don't know. It's not looking so good. It's not looking so good in this regard. So round one, I'm gonna have to say, goes to me. Sorry, Fukuyama. I think I got you there. We'll see what happens in round two. So I'll see you then.